Washington is floating plans for Gaza even as Israel is waging its war. In yet another Middle East visit, the US Secretary of State has been rallying support from regional players. But why isn't the Biden administration first trying to reach a ceasefire? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. The US Secretary of State wrapped up his latest visit to the Middle East with Cairo as the final stop. It's Antony Blinken's fourth time in the region since Israel began its war on Gaza. That's 4 times in less than 4 months. He says the conflict needs to end soon, and he's called on regional leaders to help build a stable post-war order. But there's no sign that the war is nearing an end. The death toll among Palestinian civilians continues to climb, and Israeli leaders have stated that it will be a long campaign. We'll go to our panel in just a moment. But first, here's Fintan Monaghan.
The US Secretary of State is wrapping up his 4th Middle East tour since Israel began its war on Gaza nearly 4 months ago. Antony Blinken had 2 messages. The US supports Israel, but more must be done to prevent Palestinian civilian deaths.
We know that facing an enemy that embeds itself among civilians, who hides in and fires from schools, from hospitals, makes this incredibly challenging. But the daily toll on civilians in Gaza, particularly on children, is far too high. We want this war to end as soon as possible. There's been far too much loss of life, far too much suffering. But it's vital that Israel achieve its very legitimate objectives of ensuring that October 7th can never happen again.
As well as Israel and the occupied West Bank, Blinken visited regional powers including Qatar, Jordan, the UAE and Saudi Arabia. He spoke of working together to build a lasting peace once the conflict is over. But it's unclear when that will happen or what role each of these powers would play. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has repeatedly warned of a long war, despite Blinken's calls for a swift conclusion. At a campaign event this past week, US President Joe Biden said his administration has been pushing Israel to wind things down.
I've been quietly working with the Israeli government to get them to reduce and significantly get out of Gaza, using all that I can to do that.
Blinken praised Israel for moving troops out of Gaza and transitioning to what he called a lower intensity phase of the conflict. But it remains uncertain whether civilian casualties will be reduced, when more aid will be allowed in, or when displaced Palestinians will be able to return to what remains of their homes.
Nice to see you.
The US is Israel's most important ally. Washington supplies it with arms, military aid, and diplomatic protection at the United Nations. The question is how much leverage the US is willing, or able, to exert on Israel to bring the war to an end. Fintan Monaghan, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
And Fintan's question at the end of that report, asking how much leverage the US is willing or able to exert on Israel to end its war, is one that we'll put to our guests today. We're joined from Cairo by Sadek, who's a political sociologist at the Egypt-Japan University. From New York, we're joined by Chris Hedges, the former Middle East bureau chief of the New York Times, a Pulitzer Prize winner and author, and also joining us from Montreal, Mouin Rabbani, who's a co-editor of Jadaliyya, which is the online magazine of the Arab Studies Institute, and a veteran Middle East analyst. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Chris, I want to start with you first, picking up on Fintan's question. To what extent is Israel at the moment running rings around the US? I mean, who really has the upper hand in their relationship, and why?
Well, Israel has always had the upper hand, not only in terms of this administration, but past administrations. Remember when Joe Biden was vice president, Barack Obama was pushing through the Iran nuclear deal. The Israeli government, led by Netanyahu, did not like it, got himself invited to Congress, essentially bypassing the White House to denounce the deal. Congress, in effect, has been bought and paid for by the Israel lobby. Biden is one of the largest recipients of aid from the Israel lobby. It is a very powerful, the most powerful foreign lobby in the United States, and politicians that run afoul of it not only lose support, but then find that lobby organized against them. The Israel lobby has said that they will put upwards of $100 million to defeat candidates such as Rashida Tlaib, who has been outspoken about the genocide in Gaza. So it's an extremely powerful force that politicians defy warily and at this point hardly at all, given the kind of system of legalized bribery that defines the United States electoral system.
Chris, then what are we to make of President Biden's words? You heard them in that report. He said he'd been quietly working with the Israeli government to get them to reduce and significantly get out of Gaza, using all that I can to do that, he said. He could end this today, couldn't he, by withdrawing military aid and threatening to withdraw diplomatic protection at the UN?
Yes, he could end it today, but he has no intention, of course, of ending it at all. We just saw with the South African case coming to the court for genocide, the denunciation, I think Blinken called it meritless. One has to, I spent 20 years overseas as a foreign correspondent, and my job was really to report off the ground, which was almost universally in defiance of the rhetoric coming out of Washington. For example, I spent 5 years covering the war in El Salvador during the Reagan administration, and they used much the same language that the Biden administration is using about Gaza, respect for human rights, while military regimes in El Salvador and Guatemala were massacring people, upwards of dozens of people a day, while the death squads in El Salvador were killing, armed and backed by the United States, were killing anywhere between 700 and 1,000 people a month. So that disparity between rhetoric and reality, one has to look at what they do, not at what they say. Biden understands that internationally, this has certainly damaged the United States and domestically, because not only among Arab Americans has his support fallen to below 20%. I think the last poll was about 17%, but also among young voters. And it's a very precarious election. The polls go, actually has Trump ahead at the moment, but only by 1 or 2%. So he can't afford to lose that margin. So that's why you see the rhetoric. But yes, you're exactly right. He could end this today. They have no intention of ending it today. They know very well what Israel is doing. And this, just to close, this level of bombing. I was in Sarajevo during the war. That was 300 to 400 shells a day, about 4 to 5 dead a day, 24 wounded a day. Journalists, by the way, were also targeted in the same way they are being targeted in Gaza by Israel. And that gives you a kind of a juxtaposition, the saturation, the level of bombing, where we're seeing hundreds of dead a day, just is a window into how savage this attack is, and it is really meant to make, as they've been quite upfront, make Gaza uninhabitable, and the United States is well aware of that, including, of course, using starvation, destroying sanitation systems, so the spread of infectious diseases. I mean, this is something we never saw in Sarajevo, as bad as it was.
Mouin Rabbani, what do you make of what Chris was saying? How badly have US foreign policy objectives in the region been hurt by its refusal to support a ceasefire and its continuing to offer weapons and political support to Israel?
Well, I think he's exactly right in identifying the vast disconnect and disparity between stated policy objectives on the one hand, rhetoric on the other, and actions. So at one level, yes, there is a lot of propaganda of the U.S. claiming that it is implementing the policies it has adopted in order to promote peace and human rights and the rule of law and all of it. And that we can dismiss with a wave of the hand. But when we look at U.S. policy objectives, I think we should take those seriously. But here we see the vast disconnect between talk and action. And I would slightly disagree with Chris Hedges in the sense that, yes, the Israel lobby is very powerful. And yes, it does intimidate a lot of politicians. But in this administration, I think you're also dealing with true believers. You're dealing with people who don't have to be persuaded or intimidated because they genuinely believe in what they're doing. They are fully behind Israel's military onslaught, what is now being contested as a genocide at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. And Biden, Blinken, McGurk, and others, these are people who look at Palestinians and perceive them as irrelevant human scum that need to be gotten out of the way so that U.S.-Israeli policy objectives can be met. But the other point I would make is, while there are genuine differences between the Israeli and U.S. governments, I think the more important point is that Israel can proceed in the full knowledge and with the full consequences that Washington will not impose any consequences on Israel for it pursuing actions and policies that contradict the U.S. agenda and U.S. policy objectives. And in that context, Israel does have the upper hand.
So, Mouin, what, if anything, did Secretary of State Blinken achieve on this, his fourth visit to the region? Was the broader strategy perhaps damage control as far as U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East is concerned?
Well, it seems that every time Antony Blinken goes to the Middle East, U.S. influence goes down a few notches and U.S. credibility evaporates. Because here you have someone, for example, one of his main objectives on this trip appears to have been to seek to prevent a broader regional escalation of this conflict. Well, there's an obvious way to do that, and that is to end the Israeli genocide in the Gaza Strip. But rather than addressing that, he came out in full force in support of what he termed Israel's right to defend itself. He repeated all the tropes about human shields and hiding in hospitals and schools and all the rest of it, and sought essentially to blame everyone but Israel for the regional escalation, while knowing full well that the only reason other parties are participating in this conflict is in support of the Palestinians and in order to end this genocide and this siege. So again, you know, people look at what he says, they look at what the U.S. does, and they see a complete disconnect and find it increasingly difficult to take anything that Blinken says seriously. Because as the saying goes, look at what I do, not at what I say. And then, if I may, also this other phrase he constantly uses, reducing Palestinian civilian casualties. Well, it would be useful to hear from him what level of Palestinian civilian casualties, how many bombed and killed Palestinian children is acceptable to Washington, so that we have a better idea of where the line between acceptable casualties and unacceptable casualties lies.
Picking up on that, Saeed Sadek, how much responsibility does the US have to bear for the suffering and the vast number of women and children killed by Israel's indiscriminate bombing?
From the beginning of this conflict, we have seen President Biden and many top American officials attending the war cabinet in Israel. So the US is not neutral. It is part of this war that is happening, and it had provided immediately military aid, financial assistance, a lot of support, even diplomatic protection at the UN Security Council, and all attempts to impose a ceasefire or have any ceasefire, the US had always been objective. And so people in the area are now seeing in naked eyes that this is not an Israeli-Palestinian war. It is America's war against the Palestinians, and the weapon is Israel. This is the tool that it is being used. So, of course, the credibility of the U.S. had now been exposed. The distrust and belief that the U.S. is really into peace and human rights is gone. People now do not believe that all this issue about democratization, human rights coming from the U.S. are true, because we don't see that this is being done or applied for the Palestinians. Israel also lost a lot in this conflict. From being the James Bond of the Middle East, it has become Dracula of the Middle East, and with American support. And we are all waiting to see what will the American do if the International Court of Justice would issue a ruling to call for a ceasefire in Gaza, and if the U.S. will take this, will veto such a ruling at the UN Security Council if Israel decides not to honor it.
Syed, what will Secretary of State Blinken have been told on Thursday in Cairo? What will he have said there in Egypt and in Jordan? Is anyone listening? Is anyone interested in US foreign policy objectives in the region?
I think this is the fifth time Blinken comes to the area, and he repeats the same stuff. And the Arab leaders who met in Aqaba just before he came, Sisi and the King of Jordan and the Palestinian Authority chairman, they all agree that they would not accept the deportation of the Palestinians, exodus of the Palestinians. They want a ceasefire, immediate ceasefire, and this is what they want from the American. And, you know, for Blinken, most likely he's going to tell them that he is putting some pressure on the Israelis to reduce the bombing, to reduce the number of killing, as our colleagues had mentioned before. So this is what he will be all the time repeating the same stuff. But we all understand that if the United States wanted to stop this war, they can just lift their hand at the UN Security Council and let the international community put pressure on Israel without any protection from the veto. Suspend the aid that you are bringing to Israel, $4 billion a year, plus all this military cooperation, if they really want. But otherwise, this is an election year for the United States. It is also difficult for Netanyahu, who wants to stay in power, and he's the king of Israel after Ben Gurion, and so he doesn't want a ceasefire, because a ceasefire would mean the end of his reign and maybe the whole coalition. So he wants to expand, and so even the talk about that the United States doesn't want the expansion of this conflict. Who is expanding the conflict? It is Israel that is expanding the conflict. Okay. It is Israel that is coming in Lebanon and other places.
Chris, one of the stated aims of the trip was to pressure states with influence in the region not to allow groups aligned with Iran to broaden the conflict. How will that message have been received? Why should Israel's regional neighbours be tasked with preventing a conflict which, as you pointed out and Saeed pointed out, the US could stop tomorrow by putting pressure on Israel to stop the bombing?
Yeah, I think that if you look at Hezbollah, if you look at Iran, they've acted with incredible restraint, given especially the capacity of Hezbollah to inflict real serious damage on Israel. I don't get a sense that either Hezbollah or Iran wants a regional war. I think, of course, the Arab world is rightly concerned that this could spread. You have Israel carrying out targeted assassinations, not only against Hamas leaders, but Hezbollah leaders in Lebanon. You have the bombing of the airports in Damascus and Aleppo. These are provocations. And there could come a point. I mean, I covered a lot of conflicts. Just because you have states in the region that don't want the conflict doesn't mean they can't be pushed over the edge. So on the one hand, I think that is probably sincere. They don't want a regional war. On the other hand, I think, as we have all mentioned, it's almost impossible for Washington to restrain the hand of Netanyahu. And we have had Israeli military leaders talk about this war as an axis, AXIS, that it's not just a war against Hamas, although, of course, it's not a war against Hamas. It's a war against the Palestinian people, but it's also a war against hostile elements within the region. So, yeah, I find these provocations quite frightening because there are limits. But I do think that both the United States, along with the regional players, I mean, I think the one exception would be Israel, do not want to see the conflict spread. For Netanyahu, yes, as others have pointed out, the longer conflict continues, whether it's in Gaza or southern Lebanon, the longer he is ensconced in power. And I know Bibi, I covered him. The power is the be-all and end-all of Netanyahu, which is why he formed the most extremist government in Israeli history, made up of these ultra-nationalist and Zionist bigots that have all heirs of the Kahana, the Koch party out of Meir Kahana, who have long called for the total ethnic cleansing of Gaza. I mean, one of the things that's so fascinating about this horrific assault is that the Israeli leadership is quite upfront, that the genocidal rhetoric they use is out in the open, not only in Hebrew, but also in English.
Mouin, Blinken spoke of working together with regional allies to build a lasting peace. Of course, it remains unclear when that will happen or what role each nation is going to play in that, as we heard in our report. How keen do you think would regional players to be playing a role, especially if Hamas is excluded? Will the PA really end up running Gaza? Does the PA have any credibility with anyone?
Well, as I understand U.S. intentions, the plan is to give a virtually unlimited supply of U.S. weaponry to Israel to essentially wipe the Gaza Strip off the face of the earth, and to then present the invoice for the reconstruction of that territory to the Arab states. And this is clearly a non-starter, particularly because a second element of that, as you just mentioned, involves installing the Palestinian Authority into the Gaza Strip to resume its administration of the Gaza Strip under Israeli auspices, performing a very similar role to that which it performs in the West Bank, which is basically ensuring the security of Israel's occupation and taking care of health and education and nothing else. I think the Arab states have made very clear that any role they play has to be an organic part of a credible political plan to resolve this conflict. And I think by that they mean a credible plan to achieve a two-state settlement. Well, the problem here is, irrespective of what one does or doesn't think about a two-state settlement, you can't have a two-state settlement without an end to the Israeli occupation. And the past half century has conclusively demonstrated, definitively demonstrated, that neither the US nor the European states are prepared to adopt any policy that challenges Israel's occupation and imposes a cost on Israel for prolonging its occupation. Now, regarding the second part of your question, no, the Palestinian Authority not only does not have any credibility and no longer has any capacity, it's virtually disintegrating in the West Bank, particularly in the context of the present Israeli genocide in the Gaza Strip, where the PA is either seen as a powerless spectator or as complicit.
Mouin, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Time is against us on the program. I want to get a couple more questions in. Saeed, do the US and Israel have any inkling of an endgame, do you think, to this conflict? Any concrete plan? Israel's stated aim, of course, is to eliminate Hamas. It's never going to achieve that, though, is it?
Not at all. This is a deep-rooted conflict. It is almost 1 century. This kind of social protected conflict can last for a long time, and we are not, isolated in this geographic area. They go beyond. We have seen clashes in the US, in Europe, and now you hear about the Yemenis are getting involved. So this is very important to take into consideration. The day after Gaza, nobody has any solution unless you get the United Nations. Remember, when many African countries got their independence, they had no authority or institutions. And here the United Nations had this Trust Council that would take care of that. And of course, if we have the UN involved, managing the West Bank and Gaza for a period of time and allowing for election and things like that, this would be the beginning of a solution. But You see, Israel and the United States would never allow the UN to be involved or international organization because they want to keep this conflict as it is. They are not happy with an end because they all the time have this idea that maybe we are able to get rid of the Palestinians and have a really true Jewish Zionist state in Palestine.
Chris, we've got about 2.5 minutes left on the programme. Coming back to where we started, more or less, and who it is who has the upper hand in the relationship between the US and Israel, I want to talk about the yawning gap between Washington's vision for post-war Gaza and what Israel is willing to accept.
Well, and Washington is well aware of that yawning gap. It's not a secret. Netanyahu and those in the government have been quite clear that there will be no Palestinian state. There will be no two-state solution, that Israel will have a security presence in Gaza. They're even talking about taking northern Gaza and turning it over to Jewish settlers. All of this, of course, it contradicts everything that Washington says it espouses. But I just want to go back to the point I think a lot of us have made, and that is that the rhetoric is meant to mollify the international community and perhaps to a certain extent domestic voters. But the reality, is something not only very different, but also the reality of Israel's and of this partnership between the United States and Israel. The United States and Washington is a full partner in this genocide and has proven it over and over again. So yes, and the point about Blinken in particular being a true believer, this is correct. But politicians are either cynically line up behind Israel because they don't want to face the cost, or Israel has been quite astute in placing figures like Blinken. I mean, remember, Blinken is the head diplomat, and yet he has been pushing through arms transfers, bypassing Congress and telling people within the State Department, although there have been protests, that they can't even use the word ceasefire.
Okay. There, gentlemen, I'm afraid we will have to end our discussion. Many thanks indeed to all of you for taking part. Saeed Sadek, Chris Hedges and Mouin Rabbani. Thank you for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can join us on our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on X, our handle there at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha. We'll see you again. Bye for now.